of some of the world's most prestigious think tanks and research institutions to talk about reclaiming trust in the age of populism. The panel has been rather honorously titled Thinking Heads, and it reminded me of a friend of mine from the corporate sector who once asked me what I do, and I said, I run a think tank, and he sort of scratched his head and said, what do you think in a tank? I mean, what does this even mean? But think tanks do play, I think, an important role in shaping public discourse and in shaping and framing policy debates in countries. But it's a role that I think doesn't get debated enough. It's a role that is often considered so diffuse that it doesn't, often one doesn't identify ideas, issues, and debates with the role that think tanks play in as institutions in democracies. And I think that's really the foundation for the conversation we want to have today. Democracy across the globe, as a political scientist in India, titled a very important recent essay, Are We Confronting Democracy's Last Sigh? Democracy is going through an important moment of transition globally. And in that transition, inevitably, institutions that have played a central role in making and shaping democracy are also going through their own challenges and their own moment of reshaping. And one of the most critical issues that have emerged as democracies are in this present moment of democratic evolution has been the rise of populism, and associated with it a breakdown of trust, a breakdown of trust in establishment, a breakdown of trust in expertise, a re-questioning of what truth means in an era of fake news, a re-questioning of what research and rigor means in an era of social media and quick bites of 150, 250 characters. And it is in that context that think tanks are reshaping themselves, and it is that context that we want to bring to the debate today. How does one address these the challenges that in established institutions that are fundamentally central to democracy? How does one address these challenges, and how does one think about reshaping, particularly at this current juncture? I think about 6 months ago we were talking about democracy, not just as democracy having a last sigh, but democracy almost on its way to the grave. But in the last 6 months, across many parts of the globe, we've seen a new revival of a different form of democracy. We are seeing a revival of social movements, of protests, Latin America, India, are important examples, a reclaiming of, through the mechanism of protest, a reclaiming of democracy in what is almost sometimes looks spontaneous, inchoate, chaotic, and in some ways also reflecting, therefore, a rejection of established institutions. So I think we are at a very interesting juncture where I think core institutions of democracy, including the political party system, are in a moment of a credibility crisis. Established institutional structures and established roles that these institutions played in making and shaping public discourse and policy debates, including of think tanks, are in some ways under, I wouldn't go so far as to say a credibility crisis, but are being questioned and reshaping themselves, just as new forms of democratic engagement are beginning to re-emerge. So it is in that context that we want to debate the question of the role of institutions, the relationship of trust, citizen trust in core democratic institutions, and what we can do as thinkers, as experts, as participants in democratic life to re-establish that trust and respond to the present moment. To debate some of these issues, I have with me a very, very distinguished panel. Vuk Jeremic, who is the president for the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Serbia. Ondrej Ditrych, please excuse my awful pronunciation, Director, Institute of International Relations from the Czech Republic. Stawomir Debski, Director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Poland. Neelam, Director, Gateway House, India. Daniela Schwarzer, Director, German Council on Foreign Relations of Germany. And myself, I'm Yamini Aiyar, and I'm the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, which is a think tank based in New Delhi. So let me begin by asking all of you to just offer a few comments on how you see this present moment, this present democratic juncture, the role of expertise, and the question of trust that is now emerging as central to rebuilding and and strengthening and deepening democracy. May I start with you, Stawomir?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It is almost an almost pleasure to speak among such distinguished and powerful minds. Just a few points about the state of affairs in think tank world. You mentioned, Jamin, lack of credibility, of expertise, or at least the situation in which general public is quite reluctant to follow experts' opinions. So my first point is that, well, to some extent, those who are who work for think tank, research institutions, expert institutions, think tanks, we are partially responsible for that, for this reluctance. Why? Because, we are living in the world which is very divergent. There are thousands institutions called themselves think tanks around the world. So there are public institutions, not public institutions, there are private business-oriented institutions, and there are, even, big corporations run their own think tanks. The trouble is that all of these animals try to pursue their own agenda. And sometimes, they hide their agenda under the cover of the namely think tanks. A few words about my institution to explain my agenda. I run the Polish Institute of International Affairs. It is a state entity founded by the parliament. Director is appointed by the Prime Minister for 5 years term. And there is an advisory council appointed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So there is a kind of the check and balances thing. As I said, the budget is determined by the parliament. So there is a kind of the rule that we cannot engage into the domestic political debates, which is of course tricky because part of these domestic debates are, by very nature, political because they deal with foreign policy. There are different institutions in Poland of, more or less, there is a kind of the Polish model. We have at least 4 institutions established by the Act of Parliament, funded by the Parliament, which are supposed to work to feed the government with expertise knowledge. So. But we are the only one who are, to some extent, entitled to explain Polish foreign policy, because in our Act of Parliament we have this provision, which states that the institute should promote understanding of the foreign policy in bipartisan way, for the reasons which I try to explain. So I joined the institute 20 years ago, and I climb up from the post of researcher analyst head of research office, deputy director, and I'm for the second time director of the institution. So I know how to avoid icebergs, and there are political icebergs everywhere. And one of the basic things which is important for my agenda is to try to bridge the gap between let's say, public understanding of foreign policy on foreign affairs and the understanding which is required for decision makers. There are two different things. My role is to, as I said, feed the government with the best bipartisan expertise to help them to make decisions. While the public expects us to explain foreign policy, sometimes in the sense that we are kind of the speakers of the government. We are not. So that's kind of the problems and the limitations which are particularly important for my institution.
So, Neelam, let me bring you in here. I think Stawomir brings two really important points out. One is that there is a wide diversity of institutions that tag themselves as quote-unquote think tanks, and that ranges from lobbyist groups to research institutions like many that most of us here are engaged with. But I think the second is an even more complex question, which is the role of think tanks to provide technocratic expert support to the establishment in a bipartisan way, of course, because this is expert support, or and therefore, if that is what think tanks are doing, inevitably, are think tanks then part of an establishment? What happens to the role of critique? What happens to the role of dissent?
Well, thank you very much. So I want to begin by saying two things. One is Yamini said that I am the director of a think tank in India. Actually, we are located in Mumbai. It's another country altogether. We actually are the only credible foreign policy think tank in Mumbai, even though it is the commercial and financial heart of India. But it's a sign that actually Mumbai doesn't really do politics. Mumbai is not terribly interested in foreign policy as such. We would love to be in your situation where our government pays attention to what we try and say and research and write about. We are also unique in the sense, we think we're unique in the world. It's a foreign policy think tank set up by two women. It has no government support. The results, as you can see, are that we are constantly on a financial hunt of sorts. But we have envisaged our role as being bipartisan. And we have not found that very difficult. We critique the government, we exhort the government, we have lots of suggestions to make, and we try to bring in our research and in our writing the role of corporate India. What is it that works for the corporates? What's the role they play outside? What would they like to see India's foreign policy to reflect? Because you can live in Delhi, be a think tank, and never remember that we need to speak on policies which take into account the interests and the role and the possibilities for Indian business, for the Indian corporate sector. In India, for some reason, there's a kind of division. There are industry bodies which are supposed to do that. FICCI, CII, they don't actually. I hope there's no one here from FICCI or CII, because no, they have really become event management bodies. They will get together, they will get a speaker, and that's it. Even though they actually, especially FICCI, has a quite strong research organization within the institution. So this is what we're trying to do. We have actually not dealt with some of the issues of democracy or protest within India. But we do write. I mean, I write on trends, macro trends globally, on what's happening Eastern Europe, very important, or the United States, countries which are consequential for us as well. And it is difficult not to note that, and I'm going to stop after this, that there are lots of people out on the streets protesting. Very important in this protest is to look at countries like Sudan or Algeria. Those people have been on the street for months and months because they are looking for a change, not of persons. They are looking for a change of systems. They don't want a new presidential candidate to be from the old establishment. This is unprecedented. In the past, it was always the case that the present incumbent will step down and a new fellow will be put up there, always a fellow. But we are really in a situation where the form of protest and the demand, and all peaceful protests incidentally, and the demands of protesters are now really different.
Daniela, let me actually build on what Neelam has said and pose to you the existential question. In some ways, the brief of our panel makes a normative claim that I think it's worth for us to critique a little bit. Is there really a breakdown of trust in the expert? Is there really a breakdown of trust in institutions like yours and ours that often serve that mediating role of providing expert opinion, technocratic support, enabling policy, but also is in conversation with public? Are we really is this particular democratic moment one that is questioning all institutions, and is that breakdown of trust real?
I think we are living a moment in time where there are interested groups in democracies who want to lead, who want to guide towards that breakdown of trust, and they try to undermine the credibility of researchers, of academics, of those who are seen as part of the elite and who bear certain knowledge and who advise policy decisions. For the German case, I cannot say that this is a day-to-day problem we are facing. We are not there, maybe not yet. But if, for instance, you look at other countries where even in leadership positions you have people who question data that's out there. Take the US president who questions the mere existence of climate change. If you had faced the panel we had earlier, where this was such a dominant theme, where there's such a physical perception of the consequences of climate change and what people shared from their sense of urgency, and then you have someone who sits in a key position and who completely denies the facts that researchers have brought up. This, of course, does something within societies, and what it does at the moment, it splits societies. There are those who want to believe and those who don't want to believe, and that delegitimizes to some extent those who bring forward that knowledge. I'd like to pick up one point you mentioned, part of the elite and technocratic support. I don't perceive think tanks, at least depending on the institutional setup, not necessarily as technocratic and not as supporting decisions. I would say what, in my view, an ideal think tank in a democracy does is conducts independent research and helps decision makers make their own more informed decision. But at the end of the day, this political judgment, no think tanker can ever take away and should not understand himself or herself as being part of this, inner circle that is legitimized to take decisions. A think tanker is not legitimized to take any decision or to influence to such an extent that you can say the impact on the decision is so big. What we can do and should do is we should present evidence. We should interpret the world around us, and that's one of the key developments I see happening when it comes to looking at what kind of demand do we actually face as think tankers. If I look back 5 or 10 years in time, there seem to be more or less linear developments. And, you know, from a German position was very clear, German foreign policy was thought through the prism of the EU, through transatlantic relations, through NATO, and those things seem to be stable. Now, I would say a key turning point was the annexation of Crimea by Putin, where suddenly we saw an earthquake to the European security order happening, violent change of borders, intervention in a country, in a neighboring country of the EU. And so that was the first moment in time where we realized, wow, there's change underway which is more radical than we may have thought, or higher risks at our doorstep. And the second incidence was indeed the election of Donald Trump, because there was a huge degree of uncertainty whether President Trump would actually do what candidate Trump had said. And it turns out that he pretty much sticks to his own script. Now, what this means is that uncertainty as a theme is far more important. It's far more difficult to anticipate. Then add technological change, which happens at a very rapid pace, add new security threats, add the impact of climate change. So the world has become more uncertain, and it is part of our role today as think tankers, rather than thinking linearly and advising, you know, in calm waters, to really think in sometimes worst case scenarios, but at least in scenarios, and really help decision makers weigh the options they have, because for them, it is very, very difficult to actually take decisions under these conditions. So I think part of our role has really become to think through the current situations we are facing, but also having the long-term view. And that, in my view, is a change to sort of our day-to-day advice which we give.
Thank you. I think you bring up some very, very important points, and it is important to remember the centrality of non-partisan, rigorous research that which is a significant role that we play, and the importance of that in shaping decisions. But also to remember that policy decisions are inevitably to be shaped by the political context, and think tankers must make sure that we are aware of this. But let me ask you, Ondrej, we've talked a lot about the role that think tanks play in shaping policy decisions, but we also play a public role. We also play a role, or research ought to play a role, in shaping public discourse, in shaping the parameters of public discourse. And one of the challenges that I think we confront, and please feel free to completely disagree with me, but let me put the proposition to you. Two very important shifts have taken place. One has been the advent of social media, which is creating and reshaping the public sphere and the way in which people engage in public debate. And the second has been this sort of what we call rather strangely fake news, because news can't be fake. If it's fake, it shouldn't be news, but nonetheless, and it's in that context then, how does one build an environment, a constituency for nuance, for sobriety, for evidence? And it's also a very polarized world, at least in my country. You're either with me or without me, or against me. And so, you know, is that something that we need to think harder about? Is that a fair proposition? And what does that mean then for the public role that we play?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. First, let me say that I understand that many of you are Raisina young fellows. So make no mistake, for a great mind such as yours to have a career in a think tank, that's the best possible job that you may have, crisis or not. Second,
well, only think tanks would debate crises, so that's a good advertisement for why we matter.
Exactly. Now, I think we find ourselves in the midst of information revolution, and that information revolution creates means to release people from the bind of consolidated structures of power and from ideologies that produce and reproduce them. But it's also a time and era where we as think tanks can no longer pretend that we are sort of manufacturers of objective, widely recognized truth or even facts. Facts that by definition are done or made. They don't just lay down ahead of us, you know, waiting to be picked up, and this kind of binary between facts or truth and disinformation is at the same time sort of philosophically naive, but also morally problematic, because I think that it often serves to sort of ideologically foreclose the space for public debate, and ironically, it is often done in defense of liberal politics. So the irony is there. So I like to use the metaphor of beacon when thinking about the role of think tanks these days. It may not be entirely new, but what I mean by that is that we should sort of guide those in search of truth rather than offer ready-made truths to others. Engage in paretic, frank speech. If you imagine for a moment that there are two sort of broad strategic zones for public speech, taken from Greek philosophy, parrhesia as frank speech, and then rhetoric as the art of persuasion. I think we should firmly stand on the parrhetic side. Of course, the difficulty is that for its parrhetic frank speech to be effective, some persuasion may be necessary, and the border in which rhetoric poisons frank speech, if only by reduction of complexity to policymakers or to broader public, that's pretty difficult to establish, and we run into perilous waters. So in this environment, I believe, to go back to your question, that we should indeed sort of cultivate and broaden the horizons of public debate to preserve and extend the space for rational communicative action, certainly. Some people say that democracy is not very good for addressing the big risks ahead of us: climate change, emergence of new technologies that radically transform or will, in the near future, our social life. But I think that if we kind of give up this sort of democratic duty to reason, then what are we left with? We sort of double down on the politics of exclusion, often carried by the populists, and we sort of embark on the path of exclusion until the point where there is really nothing left from which something can be excluded. Then, of course, we should indeed engage in improving policymaking to make it, as my compatriot, you will not probably know him because he's an arcane political scientist, Karl Deutsch, call for more competence, but also more compassion. And we can do so, I believe, by, first of all, not being complicit with sort of technocratic governance. By the way, kind of leads to response by the supporters of the would-be populists. We must not divorce our research from reality. At the same time, reality can be rather sort of sedating. We should not just accept the status quo world as something that cannot be reimagined. Also, that's the final point that I'll make. We should be reflexive about the research that we do. This is political research, and politics is a process in which value conflict. And it's a process in which the costs and benefits of policy solutions are unevenly distributed, and we as researchers should be really reflexive about it. And if the claim to authoritative knowledge these days cannot be based by invoking objectivity, then I think it can still be made by invoking rigorous method. Going back to what you said, not as some sort of false unity, because we all make different sort of ontological wagers about how the world is, and based on these great ontological wagers, then we try to explain pieces of it. But I do believe that a commitment to sort of systematic, transparent, critical research, also empirical one, is something that is rather necessary, because the alternatives are altogether unappealing. Ransacking history for false analogies or shelter beliefs and so forth. So this is what I mean by saying that we should engage in the parrhetic speech and serve as a beacon for those who look for truth.
Let's get murky. How do we do this? The fact of the matter is that the ideas industry, research, production of knowledge is an expensive exercise. It has to be funded. And how does one build objectivity of funding? It at a time when when democracy is throwing up a certain kind of leadership, and when in many ways private capital itself is also going through a moment of credibility crisis from the point of view of the citizen. So you know, let's not beat around the bush. Ideas cost money. Somebody has to pay for it. Ideas can't be marketed in the way that a product can. And does that then impact the questions of objectivity and credibility? And how do we get past that challenge? And you know, Vuk, to you, but I think all of us as think tankers probably are struggling with this question. So after Vuk gives his remarks, if anybody else would like to comment on this, I'd be very keen to.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking this question. This is one of the most dramatic questions in the life of my think tank that has suffered a great a blow in its capacity to fundraise when I decided to join again the domestic political discourse. So when I received the email that I'll be on a panel to debate populism, I thought for a second, wow, because Serbia is like a Harvard Business School case of what can go wrong when a populist win an election and start dismantling democratic institutions. But then again, the way for me to keep my thinking hat, not just my talking hat as a politician, is to say that my think tank is going to strictly deal with international affairs and issues of global sustainability. So from a perspective of a think tanker, despite the fact it's very alluring for me to debate populism, I try to save myself at least from this podium, from debating it. But I am going to touch upon this in a sense of I'm a little bit more pessimistic than you are in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. I think that international and global trends are very, very powerful, and especially when it comes to what happens to a small country, to a small nation like mine. I think that populism is on a great rise. I think we have not seen the high point of this tide. But I'd like to frame this debate more in terms of what it means for geopolitics and how then it feeds back to the domestic discourse, the future of democracy in a country versus other scenario. I believe we are right now in a geopolitical recession. And I think that in geopolitics, just like in economics, just like in the world economy, there are boost cycles and there are boom cycles and there are bust cycles. Only in economy, they're easier to spot and they last shorter. In geopolitics, they tend to last longer and they tend to have a more strategic impact. I think we are at the beginning of a big geopolitical recession. And in a geopolitical recession, there is an incentive of countries not to work together, but to turn inward. There is like an erosion of international norms, standards, international institutions of governance. They erode very, very quickly. I was in the UN a few years ago. I was president of the UN General Assembly in 2012. I ran for Secretary General in 2016. And it was such a different world. It was such a different global discourse in comparison to what we see now. This trend, I think, is going to worsen. And the domestic and international trends, unfortunately, tend to feed each other in a way that creates a negative spiral. And to wind back to your question at the beginning, raising funds for thoughts is becoming so brutally partisan and political that that it is gonna, bring down the capacity to fund institutions like global think tanks, thinking and debating world relations and world developments to a trickle. Because all your conversations are going to start by saying, what do you think on China? What do you think on NATO? Is Putin a bad guy? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are three sort of challenges that this present moment puts to us. One is, the closing off of spaces for critique and dissent in the nature as populism has evolved. Also, the dismantling of institutions. I think we are seeing, take climate change, countries that are now choosing to ignore the problem or defy the research and announce that the problem doesn't exist, are also therefore systematically dismantling decades of careful institution building, creating new kinds of vacuums. What does that do then for not just ideas? In fact, at that point, you're fighting the battle not of ideas, but of trying to reclaim what is being dismantled, and how does one raise resources and mobilize to do that? And third, and not least, which is sort of where I began, which is in a moment of a credibility crisis, and in a moment of a closing off, how does one then actually build public trust back to be able to resource and engage in debates that are necessarily going to be critical, have elements of dissent, raise questions, but also, as all of us as researchers like to do, ensure that you see grays, that you bring a little bit more nuance and rigor than what a 150 characters public sphere enables you to do. So any thoughts from other fellow panelists on this issue?
I actually want to say that I don't think think tanks that there is any institution which is neutral. I don't know what that means. If you look at the way the think tanks emerged, the American system, the think tanks are clearly aligned with political parties. You have heritage, you have...
In the US.
Yeah, in the United States. I think, you look at Germany, for instance. Each political party has its own foundation. I think you look at discourses. I mean, it was really interesting, and I think it's probably a majority understanding what Daniela said about the Crimea. But the fact is that you have to also pay attention to what is the Russian discourse on that. So I'm not trying to support alternate facts or any such thing, but I'm trying to say that, understandings actually emerge out of different histories, different backgrounds, and today we are in such a critical moment because this is a moment of change. So a lot of countries and people that were beneficiaries of the old and the existing order will see this as disruptive. I see it as an opportunity. I think that India needs to be on the table. I think we ought to participate in the building of new institutions, modifying the existing institutions. So I think we have to stop maybe looking for this holy grail of neutrality. Frankly, there isn't such a thing in foreign policy.
Well, there's normative positions and there's partisan positions. I think that's, but Stawomir and then Daniela.
One of the problems I have with the term think tank is that everyone can call themselves a think tank.
Yeah.
So regardless, of
None of them have tanks in which they think.
well, we all try to put emphasis on the word think, I believe, but there are of course some of us who prefer tanks. But what I'd like to turn your attention to is the following point. I mean, initially, from the very beginning, 100 years ago, think tanks developed in democratic environments. Now we have think tanks also in autocratic countries. I traveled to North Korea a year ago. And I met counterparts from Korean Institute of International Affairs. They called themselves think tanks. However, they were part of the government. But, you know, they were part of the ministry, in the sense. And we have the same situation in China and Russia and in other countries. It also contributes to the deterioration of the veritable and expertise. Why? Because within democratic environment, every idea can be challenged. If I have, you know, a very good recommendation for somebody, this recommendation would be introduced even to the government in the context of information flows which are democratic, liberal by very sense, and all ideas can be simply tested, challenged, questioned. So the situation is completely different for, you know, in this liberal democratic environment than, you know, in autocratic countries. But we, for some reasons, we tend to call expert institutions in autocratic countries by the same label. And then we are surprised that people have a reservation to the very term. The same deals with expert institutions run by no PR institutions or advocacies. You know, being a part of the business. You know, they were established to pursue a very particular business agenda under the cover of think tank. So they are not, you know, actually interested in, you know, neutral or research, but promoting very concrete business interest. And that's the problem. And we you know, we tend to agree that they call themselves think tanks and the members of think tank community. I think that's the kind of the contribution, our contribution, to the deterioration of trust to expert knowledge.
Daniela?
Yes, just a brief comment on neutrality, and I would say, you know, interestingly for our organization, we started out with a very clear normative frame, which was sort of a post-World War II German creation, as I said, deeply sort of inscribed in the logic of European integration and the West as a political concept. And I would say for decades, this didn't even have to be mentioned for our organization. But now the field is far more contested because there are players, even if you look at the changing political party landscape in Germany, we now have a vocal far-right party that sits in our parliament and that questions some of those fundamental norms that we base our work on. So I think I'm the first director who actually made this explicit again. What's our founding logic? And that is then a position in a political debate. We are still absolutely cross-partisan, but we are not exchangeable in that approach. And we put a lot of emphasis on that. The other point we really emphasize is we are not an advocacy organization for anything. We don't have an opinion of DGAP. But our researchers are independent in their work and they defend a certain point of view in the debate. But even I would never engage the whole organization. I have my own informed opinion. And just what Ondrej said, I think is crucially important. The more the debate is polarized and the more expertise is contested, the more it is important to really lay open how you come to your conclusions, sort of the decency of academic research and the data you use and the sort of the transparency you should bring with your argument. You know, while we are moving towards a world where communication is ever shorter and quicker on Twitter and on other social media, I think as a think tank who wants to maintain credibility, you need to be able to then prove everything that's behind it. So when we think about a publication, we think from 30 pages to 2 lines. We think through the whole process, and we want to be able to trace everything back to, you know, where the knowledge that we think is presentable originates. I'd like to pick up one point also of what Neelam says when you briefly spoke about Russia and the alternative narrative that needs to be seen. I'll take this a little further, and I would say that part of the role of think tanks in this polarizing world is increasingly to be aware of those different narratives and to be able to understand them and to be part of them, of course, always with what you think is right, but then to also help governments understand where discourse is going in other countries. Of course, they have embassies and they get all the data and the information, but I do believe that very often we are sort of consulted also with the question on where we see debates going, how we interpret this or that. And if you compare the advantages that long-standing think tankers have to diplomats who may have to move every 3 or 4 years, actually this help to interpret what is being said is also a valuable contribution to, at the end then, political decision-making. And the final point where I also see, in Europe at least, an important change that may be underway is the role of public funding for think tanks in international affairs. Again, in the German case, we do not yet have a problem. But if you see countries where governments come in that actually question the validity of working for whatever European understanding or international openness, that has consequences in funding. And if you look at what happened in Italy, not under this current government, but the previous one, think tank funding was cut from one day to the next, basically. And so a diversity of funding structure may be actually, as hard as it is, to always find the money. And you always have to be very careful in where you go and whether you raise the impression of actually being bought by certain interests. But our way to going about this is, first of all, a very strong diversification of funding. And part of our nature is that we are a member organization, which gives us extra independence. But then to have a very tight code of conduct, how we look at big funders and what kind of transparency and scrutiny we actually install internally to make sure that we are not bought on any of the topics we cover.
Thank you.
Thank you. As Stawomir pointed out, think tanks are not a single species, right? We are a public research institution. We're funded from the government budget on science and research. And I didn't want to come out as overly optimistic, commit this horrendous crime. But to me, it's a duty to engage in what I outlined. And if I was completely hopeless about the chances of success, I probably would find a better use of my time, and I'm not. But to me, this is sort of commitment. It's a moral duty to public service in the broadest sense. And the fact that we are a public research institution also means that we speak the language of social science. And science is a discourse. It's a language game. It's not neutral, of course. It's not a set of irrefutable laws. It's a set of norms and rules based on reasons and social conventions and of people who more or less follow them. But I think it's the best alternative that we still have among the others. For example, because it has a certain self-correcting mechanism. Of course, it's very important to be critical about how it kind of reinforces, reifies inequalities. For example, it's a discourse of power indeed, but perhaps we should be transparent about the commitments, the wagers, and that's still the best that we can do, and still the best system to produce knowledge, I believe, when compared to the alternatives.
Did you want to come in at this point and before we open it up?
There's a, I didn't, I was just like being a little polemical when I said, I talked earlier to Carl Bildt, and when he saw me, he says like, you have to fill, because he's an old Balkan hand, he said like, you have to fill me in with an in-depth pessimism right now as to what is going on there. So just as far as, I mean, it's kind of hard to be terribly optimistic when you come from Southeast Europe and on a topic related to populism. Central East Europe is an interesting geography when it comes to this particular debate, but Southeast Europe's an even more interesting geography in this regard. That was the only thing that I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think we we can open it up now for questions. Could I request you to keep your questions short, to introduce yourselves? We'll start with you, Rajat, and then we'll move this way. Someone's supposed to be here with a mic. Yeah.
So my question is with respect to the word populism. Populism is a word which has been abused over and over and over again. In 1910 and 1920, around that time, this word gained popularity because of the US Populist Party, which was basically a party of the workers and the laborers and their rights. Over the course of 1 decade, we have like come a full circle, considering that populism is one word which is a derogatory word, that the politics around populism is something which we should abhor. So, I mean, since you all belong to one or the other big think tanks, what do you think, what is the true essence of the word populism? Or do you genuinely think that this word has lost its meaning or transformed its meaning for just to suit some political interests? Or is it something else? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. Please go ahead. We'll just take 3 or 4 so that we can.
Hi, my name is Leah. I'm from a think tank. I work for the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI. And it's not a question, it's actually 2 short remarks. So first of all, I just want to come back to the point on fundings. I think the most important thing in terms of fundings is that we have diverse fundings. I think it's the only thing that can help to be sure that there's no saying on the intellectual agenda of a think tank. And that helps to guarantee that the information we provide is pure. And my second comment is on how can we help in this time of populism, misinformation, fake news, is actually marketing. We were talking about marketing yesterday and the problem of the EU that has a marketing problem. I think it's the same for think tanks. I maybe now speak for France, but I think it's the same for other European think tanks. That, well, if I look around, like, I would say 10% of my friends know what a think tank is. And this is not a good thing, actually, because what we provide is pure information and neutral one, I mean, at least for IFRI. So, yeah, I think we have a big role to play in that field.
Hi, my name is Julia, and I work for the University of Nottingham Malaysian branch. I had 2 questions, rather 1 question and 1 comment. So first one is rather of practical character, since all of you represent here think tanks. So how do you assess the response to the papers and the memos that you prepare on the part of the authorities? Does it really work? Is it implemented in any way by the authorities into the decision-making process? How do you feel about that? And another, I was touched by Daniela's statement, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but do I correctly understand that you see the Russia's occupation of Crimea as a sort of a watershed and between the old world and the new world in terms of how you see security in Europe? Because, I mean, so many things have happened within this period of time, both in Europe and all over the world. And of course, in different parts of the world, people see things completely differently. And that incident seems to be like something really small and not really concerning people, even over here, I should say. So do you really see it as a kind of a watershed in your perception of the security situation? Or it was some other context that you were trying to put it in? Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I have 2 questions. One is for the panel at large and one is for Neelam. For the panel at large, I just want to ask you whether, given the age and times we live in, attention spans are shorter. Do you think there is greater onus on think tanks to work harder at simplifying information? I am a business journalist and I frequently get thrown that by co-journalists and my editors saying, no, what does it mean? You have to simplify it for your audience. So I wonder whether you think it's more important in order to engage better, to simplify what it is that our findings are. And for Neelam, I'm not sure if I clearly understood what your think tank does. Does it engage with corporate India and bring forth their concerns to the government? And no, is that not what you do? What is it that you do with India Inc.? Because I'm just trying to understand whether they've been either accurate critics of the situation of the economy, or whether there is clarity of thought and communication between corporate India and the government, because the criticism is that corporate India hasn't adequately reflected the crisis that the Indian economy is facing. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can go this way. So, and each one of you could pick up on whichever piece of the questions that you would like to answer, except of course for the ones that are directed. But maybe Vuk, if you could speak to the populism question in particular.
Sure. I'm going to answer these two questions. One was related to how do authorities respond to papers and policies, and they just respond to opinion polls and to focus groups. If you live in a populist country run by a populist government, they just like have incessant amount of analysis of opinion polls, and that's what they really respond to. It's a short answer. And regarding the Russian and the Crimea annexation of Crimea, I actually disagree that was a watershed moment. I think it was a watershed moment to do with Russia, but it was a moment before. It was the moment of Russia's return to history, if you will, and that was the Georgian intervention. And I think that actually that was the August of 2008, and I think that there were actually two developments that happened within like a month, maybe month and a half, that really meant something in terms of a watershed moment. One was the Russian intervention in Georgia, and the other one was, of course, the Lehman Brothers collapse. And I think that one can argue that that was the moment of the end of history. If the end of history was the end of the Cold War, the end of history was summer of 2008, and part of it was the defying of the logic of the Davos man, that it's just the economy stupid, and that there'll be no more moves that are driven by issues other than economic. Because when Russia did make this decision to make an intervention in Georgia, they understood very well that there'll be economic consequences to their action. And I think that the Ukrainian crisis is just like a natural extension of what happened back in 2008. But that's just me as a think tanker, not as a politician.
Yes, I'll jump in directly on that, because I feel that what I said earlier needs indeed more explanation. What I was trying to give you early on were two examples in recent times where I felt the kind of demand for policy advice really changed. Because policymakers realized that around them is an increasing extent of uncertainty, and that they couldn't rely on their previously held assumptions. And I was commenting for the German context. And while I agree with Vuk that Georgia in 2008 was a key point in history, this did not change the German perception of Russia and the strategy towards Russia in any way, as did the annexation of Crimea. And that was my point, that I was commenting on the German context and the way there was a rethink through those two incidences going on where are we, with whom, in which sort of security architecture, and in which alliance in the case of the US, and how do we think about this going forward. So, I think from that sort of, where I try to speak from my experience as a think tanker, those two dates were key in where policymakers had a different kind of openness to understand that things were developing maybe faster than they had ever anticipated. I'd like to pick up the populism point as well. Yes, I think we don't always use the term in a very clear way. Populism as such is nothing bad. The way it is often defined in literature is a certain political style, which, yes, polarizes between the people and the elite, but it's not necessarily left or right or extreme or whatever. However, what we see, as we see the changing landscape of political parties in Europe, that we have, at least in Germany, I can again quote best from this country, a far right that has recently emerged, which uses populist techniques, but which also is moving towards, or has moved towards, extremist positions, and criticizes and undermines the credibility of elites and institutions in the way that Yamini has put it to us in the very first round. However, populism as such, and you've quoted sort of the origins of the term politically in the United States, is not necessarily anything bad. And I think the way we should be looking at populist parties is always ask ourselves, where is there something right in what they say? And where do maybe other parties who do not wish to pick up the most controversial issues ignore something? And when I think about international relations, European integration, questions of international order, we do also have to look at far left and far right criticism of those arrangements, of course, because they may hold important perspectives and positions on some mechanisms that have been created that may turn out not to be fair and not to be sustainable.
To answer that question on what we do, we don't do domestic economy in the way, I don't know, Economic Times or the regular, economic journalist would do. What we do, because it's foreign policy, is to look at the international systems. So G20, for instance, the group of 20, the agenda, what is of interest to India, how would you pursue it? Or, for instance, we have a scholar who's writing a book on the evolution of the global financial order. You know, the setting up of the World Bank, the IMF, what they did, what was their agenda. And actually, it's very important to remember that agenda. It's now called the World Bank. We know that it was actually a European reconstruction bank, and the agenda and the way it functioned as well was intended to support that. You know, a lot of people today argue that the IMF and the World Bank was set up to promote American exports to Europe. So I want to, this is what I want to emphasize. Everything is up for grabs today. Think tanks are not the only institution that are being challenged. Look at the media. You know, look at how, what do newspapers do? What do people think of newspapers? Does anybody read them? Or do you go to social media? Look at all the problems of social media, the groups, and not just the trolling, the fact that everybody has their little Google group and that's all they read. So every institution, governments are under challenge, media, international institutions are challenged. And that's the point I'm trying to make. As far as India is concerned, I think it's great. We are now in a position to influence the building of new institutions, the shaping of a new order. But the beneficiaries of that order certainly don't think so, because they did well out of the old order. And that's the kind of work we try to do. I want to just say one other thing on the communications strategy. You know, there was side by side or just before the Raisina Dialogue, an annual feature here is a discussion with Jim McGann and his, you know, the ranking of think tanks by the University of Pennsylvania. And the discussions in that were to say that, you know, books and journals are over, even op-eds, 800 words is over. Your strategy has to be like bumper stickers, tweets, all of these things. I think that think tanks should do it all. You have your one-liner or your tweet, but you also need an op-ed. You also need long-form research. So just as an example in terms of what we do, and that will give you an also a pointer to the kind of work Gateway House does. So I gave a talk to the Western Naval Command about Chinese investments in the Indian Ocean Rim countries. That was followed up by about 2 years of research to bring out a map, visual, but the detail of every project, every investment from China in South Asia, in neighbors of India. We followed that up, and of course, we got certain observations out of that. We then followed that up with Chinese investments in India. And we got some observations out of that, which were actually counterintuitive. We didn't expect to find, for example, that China has become the most important investor in Indian unicorns. We didn't expect to find that out. So it's very important to do the detailed research as well, along with simplifying, along with brevity, along with tweets. And I think the problems that everybody now we all try to make sense of is, the American president will tweet something, and the assumption is that there's nothing behind that. No research, no policy discussion, no nothing. Maybe there isn't, but maybe there is, because the American decision-making apparatus, it's a very sophisticated and multi-level system.
So I saw 3 other hands. We'll take those questions and then in the interest of time, and then you guys can respond to those questions and whatever you want to pick up from this round. I've been told that we should finish in the next 15 minutes or so. So just in the interest of getting everybody's voices. So a hand there, the gentleman there had his hand up for a very long time, and then I'll take one from here. So the lady there.
Yes, thank you everyone. My name is Franziska, I'm from Germany and I work for Political Foundation, and I just want to comment on my Indian friend, because you mentioned the Political Foundation, and I just want to make it clear, I think it's really important to clarify that it's not, the political foundations in Germany are not part of the political party, and this is really, I think, really unique for Germany. So to clarify this, because I think especially in Germany, we are facing a lot of discussion about this topic as well, political foundations, etc. So I just want to make clear that this is really important to differentiate between that.
Thank you.
And I have one more question to the panel. I'm not sure if you have an opinion about that, but it would be interesting for me. You were talking about movements as well, also about the movements in Nigeria and Sudan, and I'm mainly interested in political movements, so I would be interested if your opinion on that. What we see in Europe mainly is that there are a lot of political movements that gain quite fast power, come into government, and I would like to know also from the European perspective, from our friends, is this specific European, or do you see this more like a challenge for political parties in general, that we will have to face political movements, social movements, who will also become part of government quite fast? Thank you.
My name is Utkarsh. My question is about the funding aspect. Do you feel that in future there will be think tanks that will be, say, crowd-funded or funded by different sources? And do you think there can be a for-profit think tank? At the fundamental level, a think tank to me is a media company with a slightly different objective. And I
would strongly object to that.
But you are trying to influence, or you're trying to put or maybe I'm just wrong. I'm curious, do you see, can there be a for-profit think tank?
Thank you. I would start with contributing to the question about what a think tank is. I once met a leader from a think tank in Cambodia working on peace and cooperation, and he said, I had a think tank, I think without tanks. And I think this is quite a nice idea to think about it. I would like to ask a question to Yamini. She started that discussion round about new revival of people going on the street, and so far we have not touched about that. And I think it's quite relevant. When I think about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody was protesting. Not in the West, not in the emerging countries, not in the so-called global South. This clearly has changed, but what my question is, why this protest did not resulted in or translated into election results in those countries where there are elections. And Neelam rightfully pointed out that in some countries, even though there are protests, elections might be not a solution, at least not at this point of time. Thank you.
Okay, last question there.
Thank you so much. Number one, this is probably linked to the issue of funding. How do you defend what you do as a think tank? How do you measure your impact, your influence, or your success? Second question, in a world where it seems that anyone who has just read a book and comments on it suddenly becomes an expert in this field or on this topic, how do you defend your experts or the people who work on your fields and their credibility or their legitimacy? And third question, as hard as it may be to reach decision makers, how do you see the relevance and the responsibility to reach societies? There's this debate on the responsibility to work for the general public. Thank you.
Sure. I think I must give both Ondrej and Stawomir the opportunity to, any of these questions or if anything from the previous round, if you'd like to comment on, please go ahead and then I'll respond to a couple of the questions.
I defend my colleagues any way I can. That's a simple answer. No, but I want to go back to some of the questions posed earlier, if you don't mind, on populism. I think populism, like any political concept, is an essentially contested one. It doesn't have any sense of its own. Like think of revolution, and we do things by saying populism when we kind of diagnose and patronize people, when we say that they have some anxieties and that's why they are frustrated, and that's why they revolt against the lead. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, about influence, like Daniela, I sense in the Czech Republic and in our case, it's primarily the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the primary interlocutor, more interest in sort of making sense of the world, understanding that the world is complex and it needs to be made sense of. But we are dealing here with institutions that are very, very conservative, very risk averse, have a great degree of inertia. So what they do with the policy advice, even if it's articulated in a very modest, non-radical way, that's a separate question. But to the question on simplification, I do not think that we should succumb to this drive for simplification, to making things simple. We should not be making things simple. We should make sense of things. And yeah, it's a fine line, of course. We need to be persuasive in arguments that we make. We cannot do these, one-to-one maps. There's a beautiful short story by Borges about a one-to-one map and of the realm of what happens with it. Obviously, we can't do that, but we should just not really surrender to this. I mean, we use infographics. We try to highlight key arguments, but I think we should be trying to make sense, not make simple.
Very briefly, a word about populism. I fully agree with Daniela. When I was invited to speak at this panel, the first thought came across to my mind was that actually I don't use the term. But if you are experience enough, and if you work for expert institution, you know that you cannot change everything. You have to be selective. So I decided to give up. I mean, questioning the title of the panel about the funding. That's very interesting and complicated thing, and there are at least two dimensions. There is an internal domestic dimension, how you shape your budget, and it is very important to be, to diversify the sources of your capital. But there is also an external part of the story. I mean, you have to be transparent. If you take money from some interest institution, it's not a problem, but you have to openly state it that those companies or institutions are behind you. And the third element, I believe that there are ways of collecting money for the think tank activities that should be simply should not be tolerated. I know that there are, institutions in the media world that monetize the access to decision makers. So they invite a minister or director of a department or prime minister for a dinner or lunch or something, and they sell tickets for that. I think that's simply, for me, it's three bridges too far. You cannot do this because those politicians are exactly, put into their position to be accessible and sell their policies without additional financial constraints. So that's my thought on funding. And last, and crowdfunding, maybe we do have small think tanks in Poland which actually are being run by by this model, by crowdfunding. But they started as a open source institution, and everyone could read their stuff. Now they introduce paywalls. They sell the content. So I mean, there is a certain model, a moment in this business model, then you have to close yourself to the outside world and, in the sense, limit your influence. And the last thing about Crimea, I believe that to understand that that was a shift, really, in understanding where we are going and what's happening, for numbers of reasons. First, annexation of the territory. We all know that it is prohibited by the United Nations Charter. And under this provision, we in Europe have been built all the legal system of institutions, treaties, other provisions. And I think the last element which played a very important role was that Russia was lying openly. Minister of Foreign Affairs was lying. President was lying. Diplomats were lying that there are no Russian troops on Crimea. I think that was the moment which actually was a turning point for many decision makers in Europe, and that's exactly the reason why the sanctions were introduced. And non-recognition policy was, widely introduced. More than 100 countries in the world introduced non-recognition policy of annexation of Crimea, and it will stay with us for some time.
Thank you. I just take the opportunity of picking up on a couple of questions and then responding to the specific question that was posed to me. On the question of, as I said, I deeply object to the idea of think tanks being equivalent to media. I think we play a different role. We are largely academics, experts, policy practitioners who are trying to place a much more rigorous, evidence-based conversation into the policy-making domain, but also in the public domain. So we do engage very actively with the public, but we engage with the public both from the point of view of information, but also from the point of view of trying to frame the contours of the debate and bringing in evidence and rigor into public debate and public conversation. And I think that's one of the very important roles that think tanks play in ways that are different to what the university does. The university is a space that produces knowledge, often knowledge for knowledge's sake, and knowledge for a debate amongst knowledge producers to develop rigor, to develop method, to develop the core framework of a discipline. It's less concerned with how that discipline engages with the public domain, whereas think tanks, even though anchored in academia and anchored in the university, are drawing on those methods to engage in a robust public debate. So I see ourselves as complements to media, but definitely not media. media plays a very different role. We are not going out and investigating and telling narratives. We are trying to put a larger framework and a larger analytical perspective into the narrative. Both play very important roles in democracy. There is a larger question around funding that has come up, diversification of funding. I think that that's absolutely critical. It's a commonsensical no-brainer in my view. The challenge I think that we face today is of enabling that diversity. And that enabling of diversity comes, the challenge that brings is in the fact that when research becomes questioned, when truth is questioned, when evidence is questioned, what is government willing to fund, what are private actors willing to fund, and what they are not willing to fund. In fact, the not willing to fund becomes almost more central to the debate. And then very important questions come up about how do you ensure diversity, how do you ensure neutrality, and most importantly, how do you ensure that critical issues that are fundamental to societies, that are fundamental to the democracies in which many of us work, remain front and center in the public debate. Ultimately, the ideas industry is fueled by finances, just as every industry is. How do we ensure that it's done in a way that ensures neutrality, objectivity, diversity, and that issues that are being silenced still find a way of coming out into the public domain? To the issue of public protests and what that is doing to democracy, I'm seeing these protests as a very important moment in the democratic trajectory. I'm seeing these as something, I think that democracy has been pushed, that new populist leaders or the new form of democracy is in conversation with society. And I think the new kinds of leaders that democracy is throwing up across the globe are currently in conversation and testing thresholds. And in many parts of the world, the threshold is now being broken, and people are beginning to find ways of responding. And to me, what's really important and exciting about this is that in a moment where core institutions of democracy are losing credibility and losing trust of the voter, citizens are finding new ways of reclaiming core fundamental democratic practice. Participation, protest, critique and questioning, dissent is central to what makes a democracy. And we are finding ways of going back to the streets, occupying spaces to reclaim that. How this translates into shifts in reclaiming credibility of democratic institutions, I think that's where this whole thing is going to turn. In my view, it's too early to say where this is going to go. I think many of these protests are yet incoherent. They are, I mean, think about the protests in Chile. It emerged, and at one level the trigger was so random, and at another level, obviously, it's fueling something that's very fundamental questioning of some of the core structures of society. And I think maybe, I wonder sometimes, even looking at many of the protests that we are witnessing in India, there is no political leadership, there's no formal political leadership to all of this. And I think sometimes I wonder if this will all peter down and we'll never actually get to the fundamental questions that we should be asking. But on the other hand, sometimes I feel more optimistic and think that perhaps this is a good thing because traditional institutions have been questioned. This could be the moment to actually pressure them to start operating differently. And maybe something new will emerge. That's not going to change in the next 5 years or 10. Don't look for quick solutions. This is a long-term story. This may be just the beginning. It may disappear, but re-emerge in a new form as we see. I think it's an open question yet. So thank you very much to all my panelists. This has been a very, very engaging conversation, and one in many ways cathartic as we debated some of our everyday existential challenges and questions that confront us. It's always nice to know that you're not alone in the struggles and we're all facing similar questions. And thank you to the audience for such a wonderful set of questions and for being so engaging, even as we are, we've had a long day and it's nearing 9 o'clock. Thank you very much.